I structured this as a series of 4 classes, and I think you'll, by the way, find them progressively more interesting. Today's topic is really about why Bitcoin exists. Why does cryptocurrency exist? And I think it's a kind of a fundamental piece of the puzzle. And if you don't put this context around, you're going to kind of explore this topic without really knowing, what's the purpose. And even before I get into that, though, for those of you who don't know me, so I've been involved in the technology industry for about 30 years. Most of it in the personal computer industry, at least the first 20 years or so of my career in the personal computer industry. And maybe most notably as the chief technology officer and executive vice president at Gateway, where what that meant was I was responsible for essentially the development of the products, and was blessed to have the opportunity to do a lot of things with laptop development, desktop development, even got to do TVs and MP3 players and all kinds of things like that. And it's honestly from that foundation that my interest in cryptocurrency occurred. So I kind of view it through the eyes of a technologist. And my job for most of those years was to say, hey, there's all this stuff happening in the world, all these technologies out there. And, how are they going to impact society? How do we separate the wheat from the chaff and figure out the ones that are really going to be impactful from the ones that really aren't? And probably like most people, my first exposure to cryptocurrency was through Bitcoin. And we will probably talk more about Bitcoin than any other cryptocurrency here. But it came through that lens, and I frankly discounted it at first. I probably could have jumped in about 2011 or 2012. And, had I done that, I probably wouldn't be here today. I would be on an island somewhere that I owned, on a yacht that I owned, doing something different. But fate didn't smile that way. So a few more years went by. And in 2017, I received a phone call. At that time, I was doing some other business ventures, not directly related to the technology space. But I got a call actually from an old Gateway acquaintance. And he said, hey, Bob, I need to buy a cryptocurrency mining machine, and I can't find one. Can you build one for me? And I thought it was a strange request. I didn't really understand the basis of the request even. And so I told him, hey, maybe you should just go look here or look here. And he said, no, I've already done that. They're not available. I said, okay. Well, I'll do some research. And I figured, an hour of Google and I'd be able to point him in the right direction and move along. Well, it turned out, make a very long story short, he was right. They couldn't buy a quality cryptocurrency mining machine. And it turned out that me and my business partners realized we could build them. And so literally in the space of about a week, we went from not being that interested at all to having a customer who actually wanted to buy a lot of them, and started a new company and got involved. And so that was the genesis point for me to get involved. And through that, I started researching heavily about it, and not only generated an enthusiasm for it because I had a customer, but because I realized something fundamental was happening, something transformative was happening. And so with that as a background, we'll jump into class. So I'm going to switch the screen here and share my desktop. And there we go. So the reason that I got so excited about cryptocurrency was that when I mentioned before, in my past as a technologist, I always wanted to know not just what technology was going to be impactful, but why. And when I started realizing what cryptocurrency was about, I realized that it was a lot more than just a few bits and bytes. This was transformative, and it had a characteristic that equated to the greatest inventions, at least in my opinion, of all time. And we won't go through these one by one, but this is my own personal list of those things that transform mankind and society in a way that kind of leapt us forward. And all of them added a degree of freedom to something. So easy one to talk about here is the light bulb. Obviously, the light bulb is a cool thing, but imagine that only about 140, 150 years ago, the light bulb did not exist, and the night, half of our half of our time as human beings was different than it was today. That it gave us the ability to play at night, to learn at night, to work at night. It had that sort of transformation. It was because it gave us freedom from something. It gave us freedom to work and play in the night. And some of these other ones are very obvious, like, the PC and the web and the cell phone and all those. Well, cryptocurrency gives us freedom in money. And that might not seem apparent to you, maybe even that we're not free in money. But the reality is that the current monetary system, and when I say the current monetary system, I'm talking not just about the United States, I'm talking about the global monetary system, is very repressive. It is not something built to help us as individuals. It's certainly not built to help people in second and third world countries. And that's what we're going to kind of explore a lot here today. And so here we go. So I'm going to start this here with a very short video. It's about 50 seconds from Milton Friedman. And hopefully you guys remember Milton Friedman. He was a key advisor to a number of different presidents, both Republican and Democratic, and a widely respected economist, a Nobel Prize winner. And in 1999, still in kind of the infancy of the internet, he had this to say.
So that I think that the internet is going to be one of the major forces for reducing the role of government. The one thing that's missing, but that will soon be developed, is a reliable e-cash, a method whereby on the internet you can transfer funds from A to B without A knowing B or B knowing A. The way in which I can take a $20 bill and hand it over to you, and there's no record of where it came from. And you may get that without knowing who I am. That kind of thing will develop on the internet, and that will make it even easier for people to use the internet. Of course, it has its negative side. It means that the gangsters, the people who are engaged in illegal transactions will also have an easier way to carry on their business.
So what Friedman was saying was really two things. And the first one was that government should have a lesser role in money than it should have today, number one. And number two, that anonymity was being lost as the monetary system was progressing. So when we deal in cash today, we make a transaction, we go away, and as Milton said, we may not even know each other. I may buy a cup of coffee at a local coffee stand, and I don't know them, they don't know me, and essentially seconds later, it's as though that transaction evaporated. We're losing that in the world today. And so if we look at kind of the history of money, and I don't want to bore you with this, we're going to just spend like 60 seconds on it here. There's been this rapid transition from, I have some cows and you have some apples, so can I trade you some milk for your apples? To, a system where coins were created to represent goods and services, which is, I think, the way we think of money primarily today. And then the gold standard was created to create a common method for valuing that. Just a little historical side note. What we think of as the gold standard was actually invented by Isaac Newton. And during the, ironically as well, during the bubonic plague, he essentially quarantined himself, and he happened to be the head of the mint in the UK at that time. And so he established a value of gold. I think it was something like 3.1 grams per pound. And that standard existed for almost 200 years. The last 100 years or so, though, have been kind of a wild time. You can see that the rapid pace with which money has been evolving from the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, and the idea of kind of, again, a very centralized government kind of controlling our money, the creation of the credit card, which kind of was a whole different concept, the abolishment of the gold standard in the Nixon era, and then very recently the creation of e-money. For my research, the first e-money was actually done by Coca-Cola. You could buy a Coke through your phone with a form of e-money in 1994, but it really became kind of mainstream with PayPal in the late 90s and early 2000s. And then we saw Bitcoin come up in 2009, and that's where we're going to focus here. Why did that happen? So, what was happening was there was as you could see just from the note from Milton Friedman, or the little quote from Milton Friedman, people were already starting to be concerned about anonymity and the fact that cash was becoming a less critical part of the world today. But the role of government was also becoming a bigger and bigger concern, and the motivation of government. And so in 2008, when we had the last financial crisis, the one, at least usually I've been talking to people and kind of having to remind them about 2008, but now it doesn't seem like I have to remind people this last week. They remember 2008 and they're feeling the pain of the last week. And all this talk of bailouts and capital infusions, and that whole period, I'm not going to make a political statement about whether it was good or it was bad, but it pissed a lot of people off. And what pissed it off a lot of people was the fact that the government selected winners and losers. As this one headline shows, the government selected AIG to win. It let Lehman Brothers fail. It sounds a lot like if you follow kind of the economic and financial stuff going on today, there's a lot of banter about, hey, would it be right for the governments to bail out an airline or to bail out Boeing? And what makes them more important than this company or that company? I'm sure in Washington right now, there's all kinds of that bartering going on. But the reality was trillions of dollars came into the system. The Fed's balance sheet, through the quantitative easing that came in this time period, grew by about $4 trillion. And that pissed some people off. And one of the groups it pissed off was either a group or a person, we actually don't know, somebody named Satoshi Nakamoto. And Satoshi Nakamoto is a pseudonym. And obviously somebody with both a technical background and some background in economics. And on Halloween Day of 2008, they published a white paper. And this part I have highlighted right here is the first line of the page. It says, a purely peer-to-peer version of electronic cash that would allow online payments to be sent directly from one party to another without going through a financial institution. So it's actually very reminiscent of, again, what Friedman said, that, hey, we're moving to this non-cash based world, but we're losing one of the key elements of of cash, which is, anonymity. On January 3rd of 2009, the very first Bitcoin was created. 50 Bitcoin were created. And in the next session, we're going to talk about kind of how that whole system works, how Bitcoin is created, and the rate at which it's created. But on January 3rd, 2009, the first 50 Bitcoin were created. And essentially there was a little note in that first 50 Bitcoin, and it said the times, and it gives this headline. And you can see that Satoshi Nakamoto was pissed that these bailouts were occurring. And so the infrastructure of Bitcoin was to essentially say, screw you and the financial system that's in place. I'm going to build something that provides an alternative. And it's essentially the people's money. It's truly democratic money. It is not controlled by any government. It has a very hard set of rules by which it will be managed, and that can't be changed. And we're not going to change this infrastructure based on the whims of a politician or the ineptitude of somebody as well. And that's a good segue, the ineptitude, because what's interesting about the separation of government and money is that governments have a really shitty history of managing money. And this is just a microcosm. There are many, many more I could pick from. And again, I won't go through them all in detail here, but you can see that places like Peru had to deal with 2 million% hyperinflation. They had to revalue their currency and reissue it twice. Places like Zimbabwe, it's an astronomical number, almost 90 sextillion% annual inflation. This is those stories you hear about people having wheelbarrows with bags of money just to buy a loaf of bread. But, there are other places like Cyprus, very, very recently, that did things like they just went and put a levy on bank accounts. So in simple terms, somebody that had $1,000 or the equivalent sitting in an account in a Cyprus bank in 2012, they got like a 15% haircut. The government just said, we're going to seize certain components of your money and we're going to use it to bail ourselves out. So that's why this term bail in, you'll notice this in the upper right hand corner. Bail in was, actually the people funding the central governments and other financial institutions which did not get a haircut. Of course, dictators and tyrants and all kinds of other people have abused money and their control over money for a long time. You see that down here in Yugoslavia, where again they had a tyrant, a dictator managing them in that period of time, and they abused it. We've seen Greece and Angola and all kinds of other places go through some of the same stuff. But this history actually goes way, way back, almost as old as man. An interesting thing about money is that the concept of money is actually older than the concept of writing. And the reason that we know that is that the very first piece of writing ever discovered is an accounting table. So, and it was essentially a chart of accounts showing debts and payables from people way back in ancient times. But as I said, we won't go through the details here, but it goes back to Nero. Nero seized all the silver when he had some grand plan to rebuild Rome, and he took all the silver from people and then gave it back with somewhere around 10% less than it had before, silver in it. Restamped, melted all the coins down, diluted it, and gave them back with less silver. We've got countries like Lebanon right now that are in dire straits, where the central banks have essentially created a Ponzi scheme, luring money from ex-Lebanese, the diaspora of the Lebanese people, luring them to send their money back to the government, only to not be able to meet their commitments as soon as the influx of money went away. Now, what's also, I think, interesting about the state of the world today is that, cash, the use of cash is really declining. And I got these stats from the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. You can see that just over a 2-year period, right down here, 5% less cash purchases occurred over a 2-year period, with the offset being credit cards and debit cards up here, and a little bit in electronic payments, which would be things like Apple Pay. And so, there's two big things happening there. The first one is that you might not think about it, but the sellers, whoever that is, if that's that coffee shop, if that's a McDonald's, if that's whatever, is paying a fee for that. And that's really damaging to them. The average McDonald's does $2.6 million per year in revenue. And just this 5% change in use of cash means $50,000 annually less in their pocket year over year. That's a dramatic impact on the economy. And most people would say, it's a really unfair percentage being taken by the credit card companies for the service they're providing. We've all been lured into the convenience of credit and debit cards, but they really are damaging to the retailer. The other thing that's happening is this financial footprint that begins to get established. And so what's interesting is, governments are starting to use financial information in ways that I'm not sure they're entitled to use. And certainly when you step outside the US and you go to places like China, they're absolutely using this information in ways that, at least I believe, are a great infringement on financial privacy. So I'll give you some food for thought, though. Imagine a world 20 years from now, and we've all been going off using our credit cards and debit cards and electronic payment methods to do our daily business with less and less cash. And a new regime comes in, maybe one, very environmentally conscious. Again, I'm not making a political statement here, but maybe one very politically motivated by climate change and energy related issues. And they go, hey, we've got this financial record for you and for you and for you, and let's go see how much gasoline you've purchased over the last several decades. And let's assign you a tax based on how much gas you've used, because we can tell because we know how much money you've spent. That's a really scary thought. And governments like China, by the way, are already using that information. Now they'll come off and say they're using it for positive reasons, like they're trying to create associations in China right now to fight coronavirus, and using people's footprint, their digital footprint, to establish who they were, where they were, when they were there, and who they were by. So you can say, yeah, there's an interesting usage case, but it's very easy for there to be a tipping point and those sort of rights to go too far. And those in the cryptocurrency community look at probably especially the Fourth Amendment, and they say, keeping of this financial information and disclosing it in essentially any purpose really steps outside the bounds of the Constitution. There's another kind of interesting thing happening in the world with banks themselves. Banks like Wells Fargo are on the whole very healthy. They make a lot of money. Bank of America makes a lot of money. But they're starting to overstep their bounds as well. And again, the cryptocurrency community got really upset with Wells Fargo last summer when they just indiscriminately said, um, we don't think it's in the best interest of our customers to be involved in cryptocurrency. And so we are not going to allow any Wells Fargo account to be used to fund cryptocurrency purchases. Again, a massive, I think, abuse of their position, because they don't do the same thing. You can go to a casino and draw money out of an ATM. They're happy to let you do that. You can go buy a gun. You can go buy, whatever you want with your Wells Fargo account. But somehow they've now decided this. But they could easily decide those same things. And I believe they've stepped way outside of their bounds. So the banking industry is essentially part of what cryptocurrency is attacking. And most of us can probably relate to this. Cryptocurrency, I should point out, is open 24/7. It's open to anybody around the world with an internet connection, and even to a certain degree without an internet connection. We'll talk about that in the next session. But the banking industry is kind of like the fat hog. They continue to do well, and they're not doing much to improve the situation. They have poor service. They charge very high fees. Things like wire transfer fees of $30 and $50, abuse of overdraft fees. There's another thing when you step and you start looking at the lesser fortunate segments of society, and you realize that the banking industry essentially does not allow them to participate. 6% of the U.S. and 18%, 6% of the U.S. adults are unbanked and 18% are underbanked. Maybe even more telling, there's 1.7 billion people in the world who are unbanked. It's a massive number. And if you're unbanked, it essentially right now means you cannot participate in the world. And again, we'll get to the role of cryptocurrency in the world later, but just to give you a few snippets, one would be, imagine that you're a seller of rugs. You make rugs and you're in some Central African country. Most likely what happens to you today is you have some sort of a buyer from a major organization that comes and buys your rugs at pennies on the dollar to the retail price, and they move it through a distribution market. But the rug maker essentially lives a poverty level living, even though their rugs may be sold in high-end shops all over the world. Well, what cryptocurrency will allow them to do, and obviously the internet too, is it gives them a mechanism to accept and receive money directly from the end user. So, it is the most efficient route of getting product to the end user, but it also gives them a chance to bank and to be part of the world economy that otherwise they are completely excluded to. So I view what's happening with banks as, as this picture over here, the banks are coming through this tunnel right now. They see the light at the end of the tunnel. They don't know that's a freight train coming at them and not, daylight at the end of the tunnel. So I'm going to play one more video, and then we'll get into some questions and talk about where the next talk will go.
For the EFT, Mr. Bloom has 2 minutes.
Commissioner, Mr. President, I rise again, I'm afraid, to make the same old hoary speech that I've been making here for several years, and that is, it is my opinion that you do not really understand the concept of banking. All the banks are broke, Bank Santander, Deutsche Bank, Royal Bank of Scotland, they're all broke. And why are they broke? It isn't an act of God. It isn't some sort of tsunami. They're broke because we have a system called fractional reserve banking, which means that banks can lend money that they don't actually have. It's a criminal scandal, and it's been going on for too long. To add to that problem, you have moral hazard, a very significant moral hazard from the political sphere. And most of the problem starts in politics and central banks, which are part of the same political system. We have counterfeiting, sometimes called quantitative easing, but counterfeiting by any other name. The artificial printing of money, which if any ordinary person did, they'd go to prison for a very long time.
So I'll stop it there. I threw this in because this gentleman, Godfrey Bloom, is a very controversial figure. He was speaking to the European Parliament when he said these words. But you could see, right now what we're living in is all this talk of quantitative easing. And what nobody's talking about on TV is the fact that every dollar that's part of quantitative easing is a dilution of the money in our pockets today. And in other words, it's a tax. And cryptocurrency works in a completely different manner. And again, I'm going to foreshadow a little bit and then we'll open for questions. But cryptocurrency works in a completely different way. Money, especially Bitcoin, money cannot be created out of thin air. There is no person that decides when money gets printed. It's on a very definitive schedule based on a very transparent set of rules that are available to everybody at all times. That system can't be corrupted, and it's defined for what will happen for over the next 100 years. Everything is done transparently. There are no backroom deals. There's nothing that will come out and surprise us. It's built around anonymity. It's built around creating a system that respects people's privacy. And it's set up to give access to people of all socioeconomic levels without discrimination. It doesn't see borders, and it presents a very stable measure of value. And we're going to get into all those, but I'm going to give you one example, and then we'll open for any questions people might have. I got a phone call yesterday from a friend. He's in a brokerage business, and he buys goods here in the U.S. and sells them primarily in Latin and Central America. Because of what's happened in the last week, he saw a 25% rise in the cost of goods to his clients because, for instance, the Mexican peso lost 25% to the US dollar in just the last week, and it suddenly made his goods inaccessible to his potential clients. But he had some crude level of familiarity with cryptocurrency, and he called me up and asked me if I could help him because his customer, and he had about a $40,000 transaction, equivalent of $40,000 transaction, had Bitcoin. And the Bitcoin had not suffered from the same devaluation. And so the guy was willing to do the deal if my friend could accept cryptocurrency. And so we were able to help him with that transaction. And, real business occurred at a material level across international borders and in the matter of a couple minutes because cryptocurrency existed. We'll go in next week into, how that works and why that works. But the power becomes more apparent in situations like the one that we're in the midst of right now than ever before. And to me, the need becomes more apparent than ever before. So I said, next week, the class will be focused on, or not next week, on Thursday, the next class will be focused on exactly how it works. What are the mechanics? Why is inflation controlled? How is a transaction secured? How do you buy it? those sorts of things we'll get into in the next class. But with that, I will open it up, and anybody have any questions, comments? If anybody wants to dispute anything I've said, they are more than welcome. It's a friendly, open environment here. Okay. I don't see any. Does anybody have a question?
Look in the chat, Bob.
Stop the share here for a second. I'm not hearing anybody.
Hey, Bob, take a look in the
I
chat.
don't know
Not sure
if
you
I've
can hear
got
me.
something wrong or if there really are no questions.
Hey, Bob, this is David. Can you hear me? Bob, can you hear me?
Excuse me, folks. Hello, Harper. Say that again. They're in the chat box. Okay, let me pull that up. Okay, thank you. Okay. All right, sorry. So let me get to these. Okay. So first, Margie asked, so is someone who's never owned crypto, is this a good time or better to stick with what one knows and understands? I think that, the purpose of this class is, to get you to the point where you can make that decision. I can tell you I have purchased personally over the course of the last week. My purpose here is not to give financial advice, but to educate. Like I said, from a personal level, I think that it made sense for me to buy some, and I believe that cryptocurrency offers a haven that often is associated with gold historically. So David asks, what do you think needs to happen before crypto is widely used by society as a replacement of currency? Well, I think David, that's a really great question. There are a lot of layers to it. So the first layer is really as a store of value, and we will cover that in one of the future classes. I believe it is already in place and is starting to become a replacement for certain types of fiat investments as a store of value. But as a transactional engine, medium of exchange used every day, things like the Lightning Network, which again we will cover in a future class, will make it easier and more palatable for people to use it at a retail level. That really is the $64,000 question, though. Randy asks, when someone buys Bitcoin, where does the cash go? Well, selling Bitcoin is the same as or buying Bitcoin. You would pay me. For instance, I own Bitcoin right now, and so if you bought it from me, I would get the cash. I would be trading you fiat for that. Now, we're going to talk next week or next session about mining, which is how new Bitcoin gets created and that method. And that money goes to the miners, just like in gold. This is a system developed to mimic gold. And so obviously the start of the supply chain is the gold miners who get paid for the gold that they mine. And in cryptocurrency, the miners, which essentially support the Bitcoin network, get paid for doing so, and they start that process. Next question, can one purchase crypto with self-directed retirement funds, or does that fall under metal, which is usually restricted? I don't know the answer to that, Margie, if you can do it in a self-directed. I believe there are some Bitcoin IRAs, but I will research that for you, and I'll have an answer for you in the next session. From Bill, will we see crypto loans in the future? Yes, you can see crypto loans now. And in fact, through our company, we are already in the crypto loan business. There is a number of different organizations, one called BlockFi, which again, I'm not endorsing them, but we have done business with them. We, for instance, loan Bitcoin to them. We're currently getting a rate of return just under 6% paid in Bitcoin on those rates. And we also are loaning Ethereum, and we're getting in the mid threes on those. Milton asked how many Bitcoin there are, or is there an infinite amount? There are currently 18.2 million Bitcoin in the world. There will only ever be 21 million. That's a very important question, and we're going to talk about, again, that one in more detail as well in the next session, because that ability to know exactly how many coins there are and exactly what the inflation rate will be and how it will be applied over time is a fundamental tenet of why many people believe Bitcoin is far superior toward the type of actions by the different central governments around the world. Hendra adds, for those of you who didn't see in chat, there is a Bitcoin IRA. And yeah, I thought I had heard of that, but I don't use it. But I don't use IRAs or 401ks, but that's a whole different discussion. Let's see, what else? Well, that brings us actually exactly to 7:45, which I think is the amount of time I had allocated. Milton asks, how can you be a miner? I will explain that also in the next session. My company, Divi Services, is one of many different ways in which you can become a miner. But in simple terms, you buy an appropriate type of computer. You connect that computer to the internet and to a specific type of coin. There are different miners for Bitcoin than there are for Ethereum. And then you essentially loan that computing power to that network and help secure the network, and you are rewarded for doing so. Generally, it's difficult to do now as an individual for the larger coins like Bitcoin and Ethereum, although it usually requires some sort of partnership with a provider that has low electricity rates. But there are some smaller coins where you can participate and get a taste of it. What else? Anything? Okay. All right, everybody, you have a great evening. Same time on Thursday, and we'll really get into the mechanics of how Bitcoin works. And we'll get into a lot of these questions came about. James asks, the uncorrelated nature of Bitcoin as a hedge against economic uncertainty did not present itself as Bitcoin dropped as the markets fell. I believe it is an uncorrelated hedge, yet the perception of not having much acceptability on a larger scale. Do you see a coming bottoming in 2020 before true hedge against economic uncertainty and dollar devaluation? So yeah, a lot going on there, James. Essentially, I believe it is uncorrelated. It was placed by some as correlated, but even if we look at the events of the last week, it was only correlated the first day. There was a severe drop in Bitcoin pricing. I believe that was mainly due to the fact that Bitcoin trades 24/7 and there are no stops. There's no organization that can stop. Bitcoin has recovered tremendously since then. And so if you look, for instance, at its performance since January 1, it's now trading roughly 10% below its January 1 price. Gold has outperformed it slightly since the first of the year. I think gold's down like 3 or 3.5. But pretty much everything else is much, much worse. I don't believe there is a correlation, and again, we'll talk about that probably more in the third and the fourth sessions. We'll dig into some of those numbers, and James, happy to talk to you individually about that too. We can dig into some of those numbers. Harper says buy the dip. Again, I'm not here giving financial advice, but Hendra says buy the dip before halving. We're definitely going to be talking about the halving. So you guys are all going to be interested in knowing what that is and why that's important shortly here. So with that, I say goodnight to everybody. Thank you for joining.